Well, this is AP European History, and my name is Todd Beach. Today we're going to be talking about Europe during the interwar period. We're going to talk about World War II. We're going to talk about the Holocaust. We're going to cover a lot of ground, but we think we put together a pretty good lesson for you. So, as I said, my name is Todd Beach. I'm a teacher at Eastview High School in Apple Valley, Minnesota. This is a suburb of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And we are back off of spring break at Eastview. Yesterday was our first day of distance learning, and Schoology was down and everything was great. So, and this is Katie.
Hi, I'm Katie Lancey. I teach at Coral Gables Senior High. We are also back from spring break. We had 1 week of kind of trial distance learning before the break, and now everybody's back. And so good morning to my 230 wonderful students that I think are watching today. And I missed you a lot, right?
I'm sorry, I switched that too quickly, Katie.
That's okay, don't worry.
Here's our lesson overview and our objective today. So we want to explain how and why various political and ideological factors resulted in the catastrophe of World War II. So this lesson is going to include a discussion of the events, decisions during the interwar period. World War II will include discussion of the Holocaust. The skill development that we're going to be talking about, skill 1, developments and processes. So that will be an implicit skill that we're going to be doing throughout. We'll be really explicit about skill 2, sourcing and situation today, and skill 3, claims and evidence and sources. Our reasoning development today will be causation, and that will also be implicitly put through as we go through the lesson slides today.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you to all the students who continue to keep sending us your responses to the exam practice. Another quick reminder that on Friday, we will be starting to gear our exam practice towards whatever we find out the exam is going to look like. I know you guys are as anxious as we are to find out what the format is going to be. And we will be finishing up the course and moving on to review next week. So please be ready for that. We know there's a lot of people who are anxious to begin that. But I was so impressed at all of the responses that I read yesterday, including many of you who submitted full long essay questions, which was way above and beyond
Wow.
the mark that, yeah, it was, and not just long essays, but really outstanding long essays. So it gives me a lot of hope for how you guys are going to perform. But let's take a look at a couple of nice examples of people who did what I asked you to do. And what I had asked you to do was to start what would look like a long essay, to start off with some historical context and make that relevant to the topic of the prompt, which was the Great Depression, and then to have a thesis or claim that included a line of reasoning as to what you believed was the most significant effect of the Great Depression. So I have a couple examples just to share with you of students who did a really lovely job. And this first response is from Mark, and I'll read it if you want to follow along with me. After the First World War, many countries fell into debt or weakened economic states due to the destruction caused by the war and the need to pay to rebuild. The unstable economy was furthered by countries printing more money to pay reparations, etc., which caused runaway inflation. The American stock market crash was the final force that launched most of the world into the Great Depression. The most significant effect of the Great Depression was the mass unemployment that resulted, as this created huge amounts of social problems and allowed for radical groups such as Nazism to take advantage of the situation and build up their regimes, which ultimately led to the Second World War. So this is a really nice first paragraph that gives historical background to the Great Depression with facts, which is what we're looking for, and then leads up to an answer with a line of reasoning as to why that answer was chosen. So that's a really good example. I know I had put in the instructions that the because statement, and this doesn't have because, it's not required. I certainly never meant to imply that. This is a really nice example. Mark from Syosset High School in New York. All right, and one other example, Mia from Woodside High School in California. And quick little comment for my California schools. You guys, I think, maybe watch this a little bit later because of the time change. Todd and I are on Eastern and Central time. So I happened to see this morning some amazing responses that were sent like at midnight Eastern time. And I'm sorry, I was already in bed at that point. So if you send them a little earlier, we'll definitely try to include some of the California schools. But here was one, and if you want to follow along with me. Prior to the Great Depression, Europe and the rest of the world was engaged in World War I. Many countries implemented total war tactics, which meant all political, social, and economic potential was directed to the war effort. This completely wore down Europe, but nevertheless, they continued until 1919. The Treaty of Versailles effectively ended the war, but per the war guilt clause, Germany was forced to pay massive reparations. Additionally, there were disrupted global trade, tariffs creating economic nationalism, and the US stock market crash, all leading up to the Great Depression. Ultimately, the most significant effect of the Depression was the growth of extremely nationalistic totalitarian regimes, because the Depression had destroyed the economy and subsequently all nationalism, which made extremist governments that promised economic recovery sound appealing. So again, a lot of facts in that contextualization, and I appreciated they brought stuff in from the lesson yesterday. And then a really nice thesis statement with a line of reasoning that is historically defensible. And again, I'm sure that was going to go on to be a great essay. So thank you,
Yeah,
Mia.
those are great examples, both of them. And I had a chance just to sift through a few yesterday. Busy first day of distance learning. But yeah, I agree with Katie. You guys are doing a really nice job building that context and using, some of you, it's really clear you're using GeoSprite. Some of you, it looks like perhaps you've already studied some of this, but you really do a nice job of beginning really broadly, narrowing it down to a really succinct claim. So really well done. All right, we'll begin today with our lecture. So how do we get to this point? So we know we're going to end up in war. We know that happens. But how do we get there? And we know that the Treaty of Versailles, it has something to do with all this. And so the thing we want to do is try to build up this context in the interwar period. So aggression and appeasement, the two A's that lead us to that point. We're going to start with this cartoon. And we see a cartoon here of Hitler marching across the backs of people, it appears. And it's hard to see, but one of the words on the back is Danzig, then there are question marks, then there are exclamation marks. And you see it at the bottom of the cartoon, along the people, it says the spineless leaders of democracy, the stepping stones to glory is what it's been captured or captioned. So the cartoonist is David Lowe. It's a depiction of Adolf Hitler stepping over the spineless leaders of democracy. And it appeared in the Evening Standard newspaper in London, July 8th, 1936. So where does all this begin? How do we get to that point? We know that the war begins in 39. So let's take a look at that timeline as it builds up. And so beginning with A, Germany's withdrawal of the League of Nations in October of 1933 indicate that Streseman's policy of peaceful cooperation was dead. We didn't include it yesterday in part because we were just really trying to be careful with our time, but there was an agreement after the Dawes Plan of Spirit of Locarno, where there was kind of a gathering of these leaders in Locarno, Switzerland. And there was a belief that everybody was on the same page and that things were going to be okay. And then the Depression happened and things kind of fell apart. But it kind of begins here with this withdrawal from the League of Nations. Then in March of 1935, Hitler proclaimed that Germany is no longer going to abide by the disarmament clauses of the Treaty of Versailles, and he begins to build up Germany's military. So how do the European powers respond to this? Britain is going to adopt a policy of appeasement, granting Hitler everything he would want reasonably and more in order to avoid war. And this is happening in large part because of the pacifism of a British population still horrified by the memory of the First World War, still also trying to make their way after the stock market crash and the Great Depression. It didn't hit Britain as hard, but still there's no appetite to kind of check this kind of aggression. Then in March of 1936, Hitler will march his armies into the demilitarized Rhineland, which is another violation of the Treaty of Versailles and the Spirit of Locarno. And Britain refuses to act. And France, who protests vehemently, can't really do anything without the British support. It's so interesting because you read about this particular history, and some historians will say, even if France had kind of marched into that Rhineland, Germany's military was not yet at a point where they could have resisted. So there's this kind of you've made a move on a chessboard and no one has checked that move, that advance. We'll keep going. Emboldened, then Hitler will enlist powerful allies, establishing the so-called Rome-Berlin axis with Italy in 1936, then include Japan in the alliance later that year. Moving forward, we see more aggression. He seizes Austria and Czechoslovakia in his drive for living space in the East. This goes along with this idea that the Aryan race needs living space, that we need to push out others. And Hitler initiated the Austrian Anschluss, an annexation in March of 1938. German armies moved in unopposed. Nazis took control of the government. So again, is there a point here where any European government could have done something, could have checked these advances? There are certainly policy statements made, there are speeches made, but nothing beyond that. In paragraph C then, when Hitler demands that territories inhabited mostly by ethnic Germans in Western Czechoslovakia, which is also known as the Sudetenland, he demands that that be ceded to Nazi Germany, and appeasement triumphs again. So I want to give your attention to the source at the right. This is an image of the Nazi rally at the Zeppelin Field in Nuremberg, Germany on September 9, 1938. And I've been to this space before. We were there with students in 2 years ago. And this is Adolf Hitler addressing various divisions of the German military. So you can still visit this outside Nuremberg. It's kind of eerie, actually. That dais that Hitler is standing at is still there. And the field is actually still used as a soccer pitch by a local soccer team. But this space is enormous. You imagine landing a Zeppelin there. And you can see that they have the start of these rallies to stir up this kind of popular support. Then in August of 1939, Hitler signs a non-aggression pact with Stalin of the Soviet Union. And it's rumored or thought and believed that in that meeting, there was the ideas were probably expressed that, hey, I'm going to move into Poland. And when I do, I want you to not, do anything about that. And we can kind of carve up Poland together. And that idea, I think, sticks with Stalin for a while, because when we get to the other end of the war, you're going to see Stalin make some decisions and behaviors that still link back to this non-aggression pact. So then on September 1st, 1939, German armies and warplanes will smash into Poland from 3 sides. 2 days later, Britain, France all declare war on Germany. And that advance was known as the German Blitzkrieg, just this lightning warfare that took over Poland in a matter of days.
Which I'm going to talk about a little bit here. And I really like that political cartoon you had for appeasement. I thought of including, I don't know if you've ever shown your students any of the Dr. Seuss political cartoons from this time period. And they're just great. So guys, if you're interested, Google them, because Dr. Seuss did a lot of political cartoons about World War II that are really interesting. And he had some great ones about appeasement. So like World War I, military technology is really important in World War II. It's going to make it possible to have industrialized warfare. And like Todd just said, this idea of blitzkrieg, lightning warfare, that we're going to see them use certainly right at the beginning. And it's going to be very successful at the beginning, because these new weapons like planes and tanks and trucks are going to give the Axis powers early victory. And again, what Todd just said to sort of piggyback on that is this Polish campaign. They just overwhelm Poland, and so that they have conquered Poland within 4 weeks. So this first Polish campaign of 1939 really begins that. The image on the right are German soldiers in Warsaw in Poland, and just the quick overrunning of Poland right from the start of the war. Again, we are doing World War II kind of in a very quick way. So we're just a paintbrush over the top of it. Very quickly, by the next spring, Germany's occupied Denmark, Norway, Holland, and then France. And we're going to see Hitler then turn to try to conquer Britain. And this is going to be him really starting with strategic military targets. We see Hitler beginning with airfields and factories, and then he's really looking to sort of wear down the British spirit, and he begins the indiscriminate bombing of civilian targets. So this really changes sort of the type of warfare that we're having in World War II. And then, as Todd was telling you about the non-aggression pact, we will see Hitler's aggression, have him break that pact with Stalin and march his troops into the Soviet Union, where he's initially very successful. He conquers Ukraine. He is poised to take over both Leningrad and Moscow when the famous Russian winter or Soviet winter will force a retreat because the German soldiers have their summer uniforms. They're not prepared to weather a Russian winter. So we see that kind of force a quick retreat out of the territory. So again, just a quick overview of early things in the Western Front.
So they invaded Poland in 1939. And this is this map you see by November of 1942, all these areas that are under German control in either through alliance or through conquering. And so very, very quickly, this is, just taken over Europe. So we'll start with what is Europe like under Nazi occupation then? And so beginning with Hitler's new order based firmly on the Nazis' guiding principle of racial imperialism. Occupied peoples were subject to harsh policies dedicated to ethnic cleansing and the plunder of resources for the Nazi war effort. The idea that they need to gather resources from all these, because all these different conquered territories, and they're going to use prisoners of war to do a lot of that labor. And then some of the labor is done either willingly, passively, aggressively, but it's also, you see a citizen populace that either by want or by no choice are going to be helping the Nazi economy by contributing to the resources to this war effort. In B, Germany divides France into two parts. The German army will occupy the north, and the southeast remain nominally independent under the aging Marshal Henry Philippe Pétain, who's going to form the Vichy regime, which adopted many aspects of National Socialist ideology. The French take this position of really not really resisting because they've seen what the Nazi war effort is like, and their ideas are, if we resist, we could end up destroying our country, as happened in World War I. We actually don't believe that we have the army and the resources probably to beat back the Germans. And so there is this idea of maybe we can try to figure out how to live alongside this. And so it divides Germany into two parts, the occupied part and the Vichy regime, which it's nominally independent. I think that's probably the best language to put. And then C, Nazi administrators will steal goods and money from local Jews, set currency exchanges at favorable rates, while soldiers are encouraged to steal, to purchase goods at cheap exchange rates and send them home. So there's a flood of plunder that comes back into Germany, and it helps to maintain really high living standards and preserve morale at home. If you think about why that was be important, if you think about Germany during World War I, where it was blockaded and people were starving and you're trying to continue your war effort, again, you've got people that fought in World War I that are now a part of the Nazi government, and they remember that. And so everything back home is going to be sent, or everything that is plundered is sent back home, so that living standards are great in Germany, while conquered areas are starting to live on the margins.
Okay, so looking forward to what Todd is going to do with you for homework. We've been sharing primary sources with you since we started this last week, but I wanted to sort of demonstrate, since Todd just talked about appeasement, some reactions and some suggestions as to how to kind of deal with conflicting primary sources. So let's look at these two sources. The first one is Neville Chamberlain giving a speech to Parliament. He's the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And let's read it together. With a little goodwill and determination, it is possible to remove grievances and clear away suspicion. We must try to bring these four nations into friendly discussion. If they can settle their differences, we shall save the peace of Europe for a generation. And in the times, I shall not give up the hope of peaceful solution. We sympathize with a small nation faced by a big and powerful neighbor, but we cannot involve the whole British Empire in war, simply on her account. If we have to fight, it must be on larger issues than that. I am a man of peace. Yet if I were sure that any nation had made up its mind to dominate the world by fear of force, I should feel that it must be resisted. But war is a fearful thing. So this is in response to Hitler as he's starting to violate the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And there's a moment where, as Todd was saying, these larger powers could have done something to stop them. But we see Chamberlain's reaction as to not being something that wants to wade into these waters. And then I want to contrast that with Churchill, who's not yet the prime minister, part of the, he's an MP, he's a member of parliament at the time. And this is also a speech to parliament. I have always held the view that keeping peace depends on holding back the aggressor. After Hitler's seizure of Austria in March, I appealed to the government. I asked that Britain, together with France and the other powers, guarantee the security of Czechoslovakia. If that course had been followed, events would not have fallen into this disastrous state. In time, Czechoslovakia will be swallowed by the Nazi regime. I think of all of the opportunities to stop the growth of Nazi power which have been thrown away. The responsibility must rest with those who have control of our political affairs. They neither prevented Germany from rearming, nor did they rearm us in time. They weakened the League of Nations. Thus, they left us in the hour of trial without a strong national defense or system of international security. So, and this is the same year. So I bring this up because Todd's going to have you do some sourcing for your exam practice to remind students that documents frequently have conflicting views, and it's your job to think about who the people are and what is kind of fueling these conflicting views. I think that sometimes students learn that primary sources, oh, it happened at the time, so that's what happened. But it's our job to teach you to wear your historian's hat. And as you are reading these primary sources, to have you really think about the fact that even in the same country, even with similar positions, people have backgrounds that can bring them to different determinations about the way different historical events are perceived. And that we will often see documents that are in conflict with one another, and that's fine. And you can still use them to further an argument, but it's your job to be thinking about who they are and what might be fueling their opinion and who the document is written for. And Todd will get into that a little bit more at the end. So I just thought, given that we've been talking about appeasement, we have two pretty conflicting ideas about whether to sort of keep the peace or whether that was a huge mistake in the way that Churchill failed to have not stopped Hitler in his tracks. So anyway, just to look at sort of conflicting primary sources, I think is important, and comparing them. And that's the skill of skill number 3, claims and evidence and sources.
Yeah, those are great selections, Katie, because, and it's also so interesting if students are looking at this because they're both of the same political party.
They are, right.
So, but they have different viewpoints. And so that's actually a really great contrasting set of sources to look at. All right, we'll continue with our narrative here, and we're going to move to the Holocaust. I'm going to take a look at the image first. These are Jewish people wearing the Star of David badges in the Lodz ghetto in Poland in 1940. The Nazis would force Jews into these overcrowded ghettos. Ghettos are neighborhoods or areas in cities where minority groups would live together, in which thousands were deported to these death camps. So they crowd them into these different ghettos. And all of this is very much about design. There will be some of the Jews who just don't survive the ghettos alone due to starvation and disease. And then the Nazis would deport them to different death camps in different parts of Europe. So begin with A. The ultimate abomination of Nazi racism was the condemnation of all European Jews and of other peoples considered racially inferior to extreme racial persecution and then annihilation in an event we know as the Holocaust. Between 1938 and 40, as Germany began the war, some 70,000 people with physical or mental disabilities, whom the Nazis deemed as unworthy lives, who might pollute the German race, were murdered in cold blood. So this type of genocide that's taking place against disabled peoples fit the Nazi ideology of these are have racial traits that we do not want to continue into our bloodlines. And so we see extermination of peoples. And in C, the German victory over Poland in 1939 brought over Nazi control some 3 million Jews who were forced to move into these urban districts, or the ghettos, where they lived in these highly crowded, unsanitary conditions without real work, without adequate subsistence, and over 500,000 people died just as a result of the conditions in the ghettos. In 1941, then, Hitler and the Nazi leadership will order the SS to implement the final solution of the Jewish question, which means the mass murder of all Jews in Europe. So our source here is a group of Polish women and children rounded up by Nazi stormtroopers in Warsaw in 1943, and they would be sent, put on railway cars and sent to different death camps. The Germans established an extensive network of these concentration camps, industrial complexes, railroad transportation lines to imprison and murder Jews and other so-called undesirables, and to exploit their labor before they died. The surviving residents of the ghettos were loaded into trains, taken to camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, where over 1 million people, the vast majority of them Jews, murdered in gas chambers. Jews in Germany and occupied Western and Central Europe would follow. And then D, by 1945, the Nazis had killed about 6 million Jews, some 5 million other Europeans, including millions of ethnic Poles and Russian POWs, prisoners of war. This murderous attack on European Jews was the ultimate monstrosity of Nazi racism and their ideas of racial imperialism.
So that idea of racial imperialism doesn't end just in Europe, because we definitely see that mimicked in a way that I don't think we always talk about when we talk about the Pacific. Like Germany and Italy, there is a fascist government, incredibly nationalistic and materialistic, and it is also committed to expanding its territory. And we have going on at this time sort of this idea of Asia for Asians that they're gonna push forward. We have a definite Western bias that they're pushing in all of their propaganda, and we didn't even really get to touch on the incredible just depth of propaganda the fascist governments use. But we are going to see that they have imperialistic goals. They're going to start early by invading Manchuria. And by the time we've started really into World War II, they're going to have conquered most of Eastern China in 1939. They will form an alliance with Italy and Germany. And then they kind of push forward this Asia for Asians by invading territory that is in control by Western European countries like French Indochina. And they do that sort of in the guise of being liberators. They're going to liberate this Asian territory from their Western oppressors. Of course, this is the picture that's on the right, the pretty iconic bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th that brings the Americans into the war. It's important to note that Americans were involved in the war far before this. Churchill and the President of the United States have a very close relationship, and they're sending aid, and we have soldiers that are fighting. But that's really going to bring us into the war. The bombing of Pearl Harbor sinks all the battleships, but aircraft carriers were actually out to sea, and those will be spared. And we see the war in the Pacific is just exceptionally brutal. Lots of dehumanizing racial stereotypes that, again, I don't think we always advertise them as much as we do what's going on in Western Europe, but they're definitely there. And it's going to be sort of that brutality that's going to have them hanging on at the end that I'll talk about in a minute.
So that's the war in the Pacific that's going on. And the great leaders, or the leaders at the time in the Grand Alliance, Britain, who is Churchill, in the United States, which is Roosevelt, the Soviet Union, which is Stalin, agree on a policy of Europe first. So only after Hitler was defeated would the Allies mount an all-out attack on Japan. This is important, this agreement, because then we don't have different countries, like the Soviet Union agreeing to a peace on their own first and separating the balance of power of the Allies. So the Europe First Agreement. And then in B, there's a mutual commitment to forcing this unconditional surrender of Germany and Japan that cements the Grand Alliance and deny Hitler any hopes of dividing his foes, which also meant that the Soviet and Anglo-American forces would almost certainly have to invade and occupy all of Germany, and that Japan will fight to the bitter end. So I want to bring your attention to these two sources here on the right. These are students of pictures of my students back in 2011 of the American cemetery in Florence, in Italy. So liberating Italy and getting the Germans out of North Africa was kind of what Churchill called the hinge of fate, the ability to start moving into the continent. There'd been a lot of pressure as well from Stalin, pressuring both Churchill and Roosevelt that, hey, right now, the Soviet Union is the only one fighting the war in Europe, and we need to start fighting them on two fronts if we're going to really make any headway. Initially, Churchill and Roosevelt had kind of held this off, but it came to a point where they could no longer do that. And so in the C prompt, the C paragraph, after driving the Axis powers out of North Africa, United States and British forces will invade Sicily in the summer of 1943, and then mainland Italy. And it's during that time that Mussolini is overthrown by a coup d'etat, and a new Italian government publicly accepts unconditional surrender. But the thing is, German forces had come into Italy and were trying to hold on to Italy as well as they could and hold back this idea as best they could as some type of invasion of the European continent. And so certainly the D-Day invasion that we will talk about in a little bit is important. And the cemetery at Normandy is often visited and referred to as well. But there are also American cemetery in Naples and this one here in Florence, which don't get as much attention. But these are, all these grave sites are of American soldiers who died in the liberation of Italy. And a lot of them are paratroopers. And so I just felt anytime that we have a chance, we are in those areas, that we should always try to stop by and pay our respects in these areas to the men that did this. So we'll go to the deep paragraph. Facing stiff German resistance, the Allies battled their way up the Italian peninsula and through the Germans. Though the Germans still held northern Italy, they were clearly on the defensive. And E, by the spring of 1943, brought crucial Allied victories at sea and in the air. New anti-submarine technologies allowed hundreds of ships to bring much needed troops and supplies from the United States to Britain. And we really start to see the war changing and shifting in favor of the Allies. The other half that's going on the Europe First piece is Operation Barbarossa. And so take a look at the image on the right, this map. This is the operation. So they're going to break the non-aggression pact with Stalin, and Germany is going to attack the Soviet Union. And Operation Barbarossa are these three main cities: Leningrad, which has been renamed now, since it was St. Petersburg, then it was Petrograd in World War I, and now after Lenin, it has been named Leningrad, Moscow, and then Stalingrad. Stalingrad's an important city, in part just by its name, being named after Stalin. It would have been a huge defeat of morale had Stalingrad fallen to the Germans. But also the thing about Stalingrad is there is huge resources in petrol and oil and access to the sea that are very important, the location of Stalingrad. So we'll go back up to A. With almost unchallenged air superiority, the United States and Britain mounted massive bombing raids on German cities to try and maim industrial production, break civilian morale. And then B, the German campaign of 1942 against the Soviet Union turned disastrous when, at the Battle of Stalingrad in November of 1942, the Soviets surrounded and systematically destroyed the entire German Sixth Army. Stalingrad itself represents the bloodiest battle in the history of warfare, with 1.8 to 2 million killed, wounded, or captured. Hitler is probably, as far as being responsible, he had refused to allow any type of retreat, even when the Sixth Army was not doing well. And he said, we will not retreat. And it suffered a catastrophic defeat. And for the first time, German public opinion turned decisively against the war.
All right, so again, we're going over this really quickly, but that battle will change the balance of power and shifts the advantage into the hands of the Allies. We will see the iconic D-Day invasion at Normandy on June 6, 1944, where we're going to see them finally breaking through the German lines. And by the spring of 1945, the Allies have reached Germany. They've also forced, as Todd was saying, they forced the Germans out of Italy. Todd, I love those pictures. It's so meaningful when we can bring our own students and expose them to places like that. And Mussolini will be captured and he'll be executed for his crimes. The Soviets on the other side will advance into Poland, and then they'll go south and into Romania, Yugoslavia, and Hungary. And of course, that's going to set up some of what we're going to do tomorrow and talking about the context of the Cold War. And they'll also get as far into Berlin by April of 1945. It's at this point, we're going to see at the end of April, Hitler commit suicide on April 30th. And on May 7th, the German commanders will surrender, ending the war in Europe. And so on the other side, as US victories particularly are significant, Japan is not stopping the fight. They are exhibiting a fierce determination to die for their cause. And so even though we're going to see the Americans sort of employ this island hopping that they're going to do to keep defeating the Japanese, they're going to capture Iwo Jima on March 27th, 1945, also Okinawa, that's not on there. We're going to see that the US is very close to Japan. Long-range bombers will bomb Tokyo, and they destroy 40% of the buildings in Tokyo. But an actual invasion of Japan, it seems clear, based on their tenacity and the kamikaze fighters that are willing to die, that the invasion of Japan would have such a significant loss of life. And so it's at this point that the United States makes a decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, respectively, in 1945. Massive casualties, obviously, from this. 70,000 buildings flattened and 140,000 people killed in Hiroshima, and another 50,000 that die by 1950 from radiation. So within just days after that, we will see the formal Japanese surrender on August 14th, 1945, ending the war there. And then tomorrow, we're going to talk about the post-war kind of conferences, because part of what we're doing tomorrow is contextualizing the Cold War. So we're ending the war, but the war is not over at this moment.
Okay.
All right.
I think this is you, isn't it?
It can be me, sure.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
So today we've talked about the political and ideological factors that this is the wrong slide, and that's my fault. I'm so sorry. We've talked about basically the major events in the interwar period. We have talked about the major events, just a quick brush of World War II. And of course, that's going to lead to what we're doing tomorrow, is contextualizing World War II. And then Todd went over briefly the Holocaust. Again, it's almost impossible to discuss all of this in just one 40-minute period. But we definitely went into the skills of sourcing and situation, talking about claims and evidence and sources, and the reasoning process for causation. And causation is also going to continue to be what we're going to talk about in our lessons tomorrow as we're contextualizing the Cold War and moving forward to artistic developments in contemporary Europe.
Okay, so we'll leave you this today, our exam practice, and we're going to work on sourcing. So this particular source, let's go through this, is Alfred Rosenberg. He's a theorist and influential ideologue of the Nazi Party. And this is excerpt from his book, The Myth of the 20th Century, which was published in 1930. This is an excerpt. Nameless sacrifices were demanded and made by all. We soon discovered that the demonic forces had triumphed over the godlike by striking the army in the back. But at the same time, in the bowed souls of the surviving kin of the dead warriors, that mythos of the blood for which the heroes died was renewed, deepened, comprehended, and experienced. Volk and personality, blood and honor, these virtues must triumph alone and uncompromisingly. The German people demands that the 2 million dead heroes have not fallen in vain. So your homework then is to do this sourcing activity. And I'm sure your teachers have worked with you on how to source a document. And the acronym that many teachers use is HAPPY. So we're using you source by the historical situation, the audience, the purpose, the point of view. And then when you do one of those, either historical situation, audience, purpose, or point of view, not only do you tell us about it, but then you say, why is that important? Why is that important? So make sure that you're paying attention to when this source took place in 1930. If you're doing historical situation, that is going to have a lot to do with it. I've given you a little bit in the source line for the authorial point of view. And what we're asking you to do is to do one of the HAPP. And then you tell us why that is important. And so we're looking at, just a brief paragraph. Explain means to explain the point of the how, why, or because, right? The point of view, purpose, historical situation, and or audience of the source. Okay. So that's your homework for today. When you submit your homework, there's the email link there, the apeurovirtuallearning@gmail.com. And please include your first name, your school, and your state or your country. We do have viewers from other countries that have been submitting work, and so we do appreciate that. I think that's everything. Lastly, I want to say just a couple things. So yesterday we had a slide where there was an image of Mussolini, and I saw the arch in the background, and I just could not place where that was taken, that particular image. And we had a teacher from East Aurora High School let us know that that was in Genoa, and the Arch of Victory in Genoa. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Very cool.
There were a number of you students that in your homework, you also said, wished me happy birthday. So that was very gracious. And I thank you for that. And then finally, Katie and I just want to make sure that we give a shout out to our producer, Sarah. So she is with us every day. She's in New Jersey. Katie's in Miami. I'm in Minneapolis, and we're working to bring all this to you each day. But we want to make sure we say thank you to Sarah for all her work too.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. I hope you guys had a good day. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I hope distance learning is going well. We appreciate you tuning in.
I'm going to get to go Zoom with all 230 of my students right now. So I'm excited about that. Yeah.
That'll be something.
I know I haven't seen their faces, so I'm excited to see them.
It'll be good to see faces.
Anyway, have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow.
All right. Take care.